For those of you who are visiting, as Jonathan mentioned at the beginning of the service, we're in our second week of our annual Bible on Broadway series. And seeing and hearing God's voice in the wisdom in the arts isn't anything new for this church community. This is our 8th year of the worship series, and our Room 2 community also hosts an annual Faith on Vinyl class series. We usually do that in the summertime. Facebook reminded me that in 2010, before I was an appointed clergy here, I facilitated an 8-week class in the summertime called Listening for God on Broadway. When I was a student at Perkins in seminary, I embraced this passion I had for musicals and wrote an essay titled Defying Gravity, Theological Reflections on the Broadway musical Wicked. I am not reading that essay to you today. But I do remember having visions of writing a book. That is, until I learned how expensive it would be to get licensing rights to all of this and all of those lyrics and all of those pictures. Kudos to you artists out there who can deal in licensing issues on a regular basis. But this is the first time, I believe, that we've had 2 musicals, one after the other, with a similar storyline, continuous, same characters even. Last week, the choir and Gabe and Emily and Pastor Jonathan shared message about finding home. And we learned from The Wizard of Oz and The Wiz, a powerful message and music. Today, we're taking a look at the musical Wicked, which is connected to The Wizard of Oz as a prequel to Dorothy's story. And rather than focus on Dorothy this week, we're introduced to the story of Glinda, also known as the Good Witch, and Elphaba, the Wicked Witch of the West. I cannot go into the whole storyline here. That would take too long, and you might miss your Cowboys game. But what I can focus on is a theme of acceptance. We can learn a lot about the revelation and theme that everyone has a story, everyone has a purpose, and everyone can live into that spirit-breathed purpose, that our heritage and our culture matter. We ask ourselves, what happens when we allow others to define who we are, others to define our values, others to define our worth, rather than standing firm in those and identify each person as a child of God, equally worthy of dignity and acceptance and love. So as minimal background, I'll share that Elphaba was born into a family with challenges. A father who left them, a mother who made some questionable decisions, a sister whose collapsing body gave up on her to make her live in a wheelchair. Everyone in the family had challenges, and Elphaba wasn't alone. For some reason, which she didn't know at the time, she was born with green skin, and she was judged as being different for that. This poses a challenge when Elphaba and her sister Nessa enter Shiz University. It's a prestigious university where students with magical gifts are instructed in magic and advanced sciences. And that's where Elphaba, a witch who happened to have green skin, was paired with a roommate to Glinda, later known as Glinda. I want you to notice that I use the original Glinda and Elphaba here because I'm old. Glinda is the queen of popularity at Shiz U. She helps us to see that much of Shiz is cliquish and that there are social hierarchies that must be adhered to. And Elphaba was clearly on the lower rung of that ladder. And even so, over time, Elphaba and Glinda become friends, and they're invited to Oz to meet the wizard, who, it turns out, is joined with a few others to quite literally silence animals who use their voices to teach, especially teach things that maybe the wizard doesn't want people to hear. The wizard and friends were intent on converting animals to do their bidding, and they wanted Elphaba, with her extraordinary power of magic, to help them. That, along with the requisite love interest competition common in musicals, causes the 2 women to split in their friendship. I'll share 2 more things about the story. Elphaba finds her own voice, and she and Glenda become friends again. They reconcile. I know there's a whole lot I left out. If you've seen it, you just need to go see the show to get the rest of it. But as I said, one of the themes here is acceptance. That is, acceptance of ourselves as we are, just as God created us. Black or brown or white or even green. Acceptance of these powerful gifts we've been given. It did take Elphaba a bit of time to acknowledge that she has her own voice and can use it for the good of herself and for others. Paul tells us this in Ephesians 4. In light of all this, here's what I want you to do. While I'm locked up here, a prisoner for the master, I want you to get out there and walk. Better yet, run on the road God called you to travel. I don't want any of you sitting around on your hands. I don't want anyone strolling off down some path that goes nowhere. And mark that you do this with humility and discipline, not in fits and starts, but steadily pouring yourselves out for each other in acts of love, alert at noticing differences, and quick at mending fences. This is from the Message paraphrase of the Ephesians 4. So when Elphaba learns that Oz is not the place she's dreamed of, and that the wizard is not everything that she expected, in fact, is someone drunk on power and wants to turn anyone who opposes him into a silent creature, unable to stand up for themselves or others, well, she responds with this song, Defying Gravity. You heard it earlier. Let me share some of the words without the music behind it. So if you care to find me, look to the western sky. As someone told me lately, everyone deserves a chance to fly. And if I'm flying solo, at least I'm flying free. To those who'd ground me, take a message back from me. Tell them how I'm defying gravity. I'm flying high, defying gravity. And soon I'll match them in renown. And nobody in all of Oz, no wizard that there is or was, is ever going to bring me down. She's saying she's ready. Maybe others want to pull her towards Oz, letting gravity do its bit. But Elphaba's ready to set herself on the road to using her gifts to help others, that she can speak out and show how terrible this treatment is of her friends, all of them, human and animal, just how horribly wrong it all is. There is no loving neighbor here with the wizard because the neighbor is different. Isn't that something that God tells us over and over again through Scripture? Matthew 22, I know you've heard it. We read where Jesus affirms the two greatest commandments. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment, and a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. He says, on these two laws hang all the laws and the prophets. It's not just understanding the commandments that Jesus shares here, but when combined with Paul's words that we read earlier, we're told to love God, love our neighbor, and walk on the road that God has called us to travel. And once Elphaba understands that she can use her gifts, her compassion, her love of neighbor for good, well, we'll get into that song in a minute. Now, I want you to know I love the musical Wicked. As with many of my favorites, I can blast the tunes in my car, singing loudly, and that alone will make my day a good one. But when the song is over, I get out of the car and offer wander through my day, maybe humming the tune for a bit, but overall, not exactly living my life as the lessons from stories in musicals encourage me to do. This past weekend, I wasn't being joyful and listening to music for much of the time. A few months ago, Colin Packer, a pastor friend of mine who works for LTR Ministries, invited me on an immersion trip to the border in El Paso and Juarez. Colin is currently one of our facilitators along with Cecil Taylor. here at Arapahoe in the 5-week Let's Talk Race series that we started earlier this month. And the cohort that was attending the immersion was on week 4 of that Let's Talk Race series too. I'd like to say that I'd go on this trip no matter what, but I was instantly intrigued, you can read that as fangirling if you want, when I learned that 2 professors would also be on the trip, Dr. Jamar Tisby and Dr. Robert Chow Romero. Dr. Tisby is a history professor at Louisville University, and he wrote the book and hosted the video series called The Color of Compromise, about how the church has been complicit in advancing racism. We used that in our first year here when we piloted the Journey Towards Racial Justice program that still continues today. And he was an early advocate of calling out racism and learning how to address it in his book, How to Fight Racism. Dr. Romero is an ordained pastor and professor of Chicano Studies and Asian American Studies at UCLA. He wrote this fabulous book that we're going to have a book discussion about called Brown Church, Toward a Perspective of Latino Christian History and Identity. I'll be sharing more of my weekend experiences later in November in the Journey Towards Racial Justice gathering on November 23rd after worship. But today, I'd like to share about 2 families we met on Saturday morning as we first entered into Juarez on the other side of the wall. We were led by Pastor Rosalio, who shows migrants exactly what it means to be the hands and feet of Christ. Pastor Rosalio holds this really fine line between the community, the law, and the cartel, each respecting him because he's a man of the cloth, but also because he's there solely to protect the migrants and to share the love of God with them. Law enforcement appreciates that he doesn't make trouble, that he's truly there with a good heart, so they stay away. And the cartel leaves him alone as well, because he doesn't bring the policia around his work. Pastor took us to the first shelter in a very inconspicuous neighborhood. It could have been one of ours outside of this church. You would consider it a decent, normal house, small but settled. And inside, 2 families and an elderly man lived together. They found the house when Pastor heard about their troubles and invited them to stay. And we listened to their story, which was translated by one of our hosts, Anya. The first family had a father and a mother, a teenage son, and a young boy around 7. They fled Venezuela because of the famine in their area, as well as the crime, and took off for Chile, where the second boy was born, and within about a year, they learned that he had extreme autism. The parents were thankful that they had resources and career skills that could carry them from Venezuela to Chile. He was an engineer and she was an attorney, but there were no services for their son in Chile. So they decided to come to the U.S., which is the place where they knew they would find help to serve him. And so they made the trip to the Juarez border. There were more challenges than getting the proper visa, moving the family, and finding resources for the child, because he also had a problem eating solid food. And the only way he could get the proper nutrition was to use a blender to soften the food into liquid form. So they carried the proper equipment with them from Chile to Juarez. Some might say that they did it the right way. They applied for asylum, received a date and time for an appointment, came across the border to keep that appointment. But even so, they were detained. At least as a family, I'm appreciative for that, and kept in a detention center for several days. All of their belongings, including the blender, were taken. No amount of explaining or crying or begging was effective to get that blender back. And the little boy went 3 days without eating. They said that no one had compassion or would listen to them. They were assumed to be wicked. Within a few days, they returned back into Juarez, and that's where they found Pastor Rosalio, who took them in and cared for them in the shelter house. They've been there since January of this year, and now help to care for the house and landscaping, and they are effectively managers of the house as other families come in. The father shared that one of the most troubling things about the detention center was that they weren't even looked upon as human. They were ignored when they had questions, barely fed, slept on concrete. He's deeply appreciative for the house in Juarez. A second family, a mother and her 2 daughters, fled from Honduras, where the family ran a grocery store. The cartel insisted on being paid for security for them, and when the father declined, they told the family they killed him in front of the family. And they told the family that they would come back and kill the 10-year-old girl if they didn't pay up next week. So they fled. They fled to Juarez in order to get across the border, to apply for asylum. They knew it was unlikely that they would get into the U.S., even by claiming asylum from the cartel. That's because they arrived 2 days after the administration closed the border. They, the 2 of them, somehow found Pastor Rosalio and made a home in the house. And as the mother was sharing the story, we were all in a circle. The 10-year-old girl came over and sat beside me on a stool. And as she's sharing the story of how her father was shot, she started to cry. These weren't quiet tears, as you can imagine. They were traumatic and frightened, as she probably was remembering the exact scene of her father's death. And there I was standing beside her, not sure what to do, asking myself, is it okay to touch her? Is it okay to hug her? What else could I do? I reached my arm around her and held her closely as she cried. And she replied by wrapping her arms around me and crying harder. And as mothers sometimes do, I swayed and I rocked until she stopped. It took her several minutes while her mother continued the story. And I looked up at her mother, who was standing on the other side of this circle from me, looked at her, mother to mother, and saw relief in her tear-filled eyes. Someone else had their arm around her daughter, and it's as if they finally felt human again because people showed care and compassion. Others in the circle started hugging each other, loving neighbors, knowing that there is still kindness in the world. And as we finished up our questions for the family, one loomed large in my memory. How do you have the strength to deal with all of this? How do you have the courage to stay? The disappointment in a country you were convinced would help, the need to hide out, not being active in the world. And the father's answer was, it's our faith. We have faith that we are where we are supposed to be, and that while we're here, we will help others to lean on us to have faith that they do not. We don't blame anyone. We have faith that God will use us to bring good out of this. My goodness, he might as well have been quoting Romans 8:28. We know that God works all things together for good for ones who love God, for those who are called according to God's purpose. This may be a different country than ours, but they continue to encourage others to remain tied to their home country, their culture, and all that they were meant to be. And when we returned to the vans, I listened to the conversation, and here's some of what I heard. Their faith. How do they have such faith with all that's happened? Another person said, it's the faith of the refugee and immigrant church that can save the American church. That was Dr. Romero. And he continued to share what he believed about the Brown Church. It's not only what the migrant and immigrant church believes, it's what they carry with them. A rich culture of history and stories that have helped them build the culture of their people over centuries. Dr. Romero shared that we cannot give all to God and our neighbor if we leave out stories and experiences of our heritage. We carry it all on the road to embracing our identity and loving our neighbor, listening to our neighbor and celebrating their culture. Dr. Romero put this in the context of Revelation 21, which is a chapter that describes the New Jerusalem, the city at the end, where all peoples are gathered together as one in unity. And he focuses on one verse, verse 26. People will bring into it the glory and the honor of nations. Not just one nation, all nations. And it's from this passage that Dr. Romero builds a doxa theology. Doxa in Greek means glory or honor. But some translators pick up the cultural aspect of the words and translate it as wealth. So people will bring into it the glory and honor and wealth of the nations. That wealth, that doxa, is the cultural wealth that we all bring with us and celebrate. These families bring doxa, the unique and good gifts of their ethnicity and identity, to contribute to make us all whole. We're better for the diversity of God's people, much better. And it's a good and joyful thing to follow that, embrace it for ourselves, to encourage others to embrace it, and to say it loud. We are here in all of our identity. I imagine that's some of what Elphaba does when she sings Defying Gravity, don't you? God doesn't call us to have a premeditated indifference to the different cultures in the world. And gravity doesn't just anchor us to the earth. It anchors us to each other. When we listen to the stories of migrants, immigrants, people with a different skin color than our own, people with challenges that we will never know, when we really allow ourselves to listen with compassionate ears, we're changed. And at the end of Wicked, Glenda and Elphaba acknowledge that they have at times messed up. But as I believe, God's grace is there to help forgive each other. And they're better for it. It's not easy, but as is often the case, the music shares the moment. I've heard it said that people come into our lives for a reason, bringing something we must learn, and we are led to those who help us most to grow if we let them, and we help them in return. Well, I don't know if I believe that's true, but I know I am who I am today because I knew you. God's grace was there as I listened to the stories of migrants in Juarez. Learning compassion and humility, changing me deeply for the stories that I heard. We left better people with an imprint of these migrant families on our hearts. You know, when we drove up to that house at first, we were listening to music from the radio. Sometimes I would even sing along. And when we returned to the van to leave the house, I realized one thing. When we listen to the stories of others, when we open our hearts to let God lead the way to embrace our calling, well, we can't just turn the music back on and go back to normal. We are changed for good. May it ever be so. Amen.